and anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. All right. I'm going to share the PowerPoint. Everyone could still see me floating on their screen, I suppose, right? Am I still there? Yeah, okay, beautiful. All right, so we're going to begin talking about the Akdamus. And if you're Sephardi, or if you have the understandable habit of falling asleep by Kriyas HaTorah on Shavuos, then you might not know what the Akdamus is. So the Akdamus is a piyyut, that a liturgical poem that the Ashkenazim say on Shavuos, the first day of Shavuos, and they say this piyyut. Interestingly, in many hardcore Ashkenazi places, they say it during the Kriyas HaTorah. They'll say the first pasuk of Kriyas HaTorah. They'll begin the Kriyas HaTorah. They'll say the first pasuk, and then they begin the Akdamus. So this is a very interesting minig. Many Ashkenazi places recently have begun saying it before the brachas of Kriyas HaTorah. And this piyyut is sung responsively. It's an Aramaic piyyut. And the chazan will begin with the first stanza, and everybody replies. He'll do Akdamos Millin v'shayisashusa v'shakilna harmon urshusa, etc. And the entire kahal will respond to this to the piyyut, and they continue with him. Now, it is in Aramaic. It's a very difficult Aramaic, and we're going to explore tonight the history of this very out of place, very strange piyyut. And just to quote Jeffrey Hoffman, who wrote an article on the Akdamus, he says, "Why such a lengthy literary creation in a language foreign to most Jews, introducing a translation of the Torah reading not used for a millennium, continue to be so popular and widely recited?" So to answer this question, we're going to have to unravel about 2,000 years of history of Targum, of Torah reading, of piyyut poetry, and Shavuos customs. So we're going to have a splendid time. So the first thing we're going to discuss is, let's discuss Shavuos for a second. Now, the Shavuos is called Chag HaKatzir, or Zman Matan Torah Seinu. This is a holiday that, unlike all the other holidays, doesn't really have any special features. If you look at the Shulchan Aruch in Taf Tzadi Dalid, he has one siman, 3 seifim, and that's the entirety of Hilchos Shavuos. The Achronim have a few more things, but that's it. There's no lulav, there's no matzah, there's no maror, there's no sukkah, there's no objects, there's no tangible mitzvahs to Shavuos to make the holiday special. For this reason, many Jews who are not so affiliated with Judaism have no idea what Shavuos is. And therefore, throughout the history of Klal Yisrael, people had to find ways in order to make Shavuos more meaningful, to give it some sort of visual or sensory mode in their consciousness. So one of the first ways that Shavuos developed a sensory experience, so to speak, was through the Tefilah. The first part of Shavuos that became the most ingrained feature of Shavuos was, by default, the Tefilah, the meaning of the holiday as the time when Hashem chose the Jewish people to give them the Torah rather than the other nations. And all the midrashim involved with that, that was the first, focus of Shavuos for the Jewish people, as we're going to see very soon. However, by the Middle Ages, the practice of adorning the Beis HaKnesses with greenery, based on a medrash that Har Sinai got filled with flowers, became very popular. As you could see here in the artwork I'm showing you behind me, this is from the tripartite machzor. It's a 3-volume machzor. The volume on Shavuos is in the British Library. This is the introduction to Rus, and as you could see here, there's obviously 2 features. One of them is the minig of reciting Megillas Rus on the bottom, and then you have all the greenery in the leaves and the flowers here. Now you might notice here that a lot of the heads are animals. So that's called zoocephalic imagery. And if you know about the bird's head Haggadah, for example, in the bird's head Haggadah, all the Jews have animal heads, and all the Gentiles have human heads. In this, the males, I'm sorry, so I'm gonna have to mute somebody. I'm not sure how to do this. Can everybody mute themselves if possible? I'm just trying to okay, so basically over here the men have human heads and the women have female heads. This is the equivalent of almost like when the Mishpacha magazine won't put in pictures of women. Over here you have somebody telling the artist who was commissioned to write this machzor, no pictures of women. So for some reason, all the women have animal heads. This on the bottom here, the green cloak is Rus. She looks something like an elf. I'm not sure what it is, but it's terrific fun. So this is the tripartite machzor, and this gives you a little bit of an idea of what medieval Jews thought about when they thought about Shavuos. They definitely thought about the Tefilah, but also saying Megillas Rus, making the Beis HaKnesses green, and also, as we all know, dairy and honey, and making dishes of that nature. Now, in modern times, obviously, the main feature of Shavuos has become to learn all night by Shavuos, and that really became, based on the minhag of the Arizal, this became the focus of Shavuos for many people. But originally, staying up all night was just not a part of Shavuos, and for what people had was the davening, they had the flowers, and they had the food. This gave them a visual and sensory experience to be a part of their consciousness for what is Shavuos. You smell the cheesecake, you know it's Shavuos. So before the modern era, as I've spoken, and even before the medieval times, Tefilah was the center and the focus and the most important feature of Shavuos. So in the time of the Gaonim, and let me just move the slide over. In the time of the Gaonim, there were two great legacies of poetic adornment to the Tefilah, which were born. There was the legacy of the Azharot, which was born in the yeshivot of Bavel, in the Gaonic yeshivas of Bavel. And then there was the Targumim, to simplify, which were born in the yeshivot of Eretz Yisrael. And these legacies of poetic adornment to the Tefilah of Shavuos lasted about 1,000 years, and they had a development for almost 1,000 years. So just if you're not familiar, I'm going to point to you on the map here. You have in the northern Mesopotamian region, which we would call Baghdad today, you have the Academy of Pumbedisa and the Academy of Sura. Originally, these were in cities like Pumbedisa and Sura, and they eventually moved under the Fatimid Caliphate to Baghdad proper, just like Mir and Chaim Berlin is in Brooklyn today, same idea. And then you had the yeshivos of Yerushalayim, the Eretz Yisrael Gaonate, which was run by Gaonim in Eretz Yisrael in Ramla or in Tiberia, in the different areas of Eretz Yisrael. They were not typically in Yerushalayim. And each one of these Gaonates had their own jurisdictions. So the Gaonate, the office of the Gaonim, would paskin and would appoint rabbis for people under their jurisdiction. So in Bavel, they would control almost all of this area. I don't know if you could see my mouse, but all of this area up until Eretz Yisrael and much of Egypt as well. And very often areas of Spain and in the Maghreb. And the Eretz Yisrael Gaonate had jurisdictions in southern Italy, in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Sicily, many different places that there was their jurisdiction. So this tonight we're not going to spend time in the Azharot. The Azharot are interesting. I believe they're very interesting, but maybe most of the audience tonight is Ashkenazim. To understand the Akdamot, we have to understand the legacy of poetic adornment of the Targumim. So what is the Targum of Kriyas HaTorah? So as we all know, anybody who's learned Maseches Megillah, for example, we all know that the Targum is an essential part of Kriyas HaTorah in the time of the Tanaim. So the Kriyas HaTorah in Tanaic times and earlier was a form of teaching. It was such an essential part of communal liturgies that many scholars believe that liturgy was born from Kriyas HaTorah. When people would come together in the Beis HaKnesses to be taught from the Torah, they would then also say prayers. But the idea of the Kriyas HaTorah was to teach the common folk and to make them more learned in Torah. So it was essential and understood that there would be a translator or a meturgaman who would translate every pasuk of the Torah. So in the olden days, we're talking all the way, we'll talk about the dating in a minute, but at least in the time of the Tanaim, you would have two readers. You'd have the Oila, the person who has the Aliyah, who's reading his portion of the Torah, and then you have a meturgaman who translates every pasuk that he says. So it's basically they hand off one to the other, and the Teimanim still do this until this day. The Mishnah and the Tosefta in Megillah mention this in passing. They mention as if it's just a standard fact. But the Mishnah, the Tosefta adds an interesting note from a cultural perspective. It says that the translation was not allowed to be literal. It had to be a bit figurative. It had to impart the meaning of the text. When the Meturgaman was going to translate for the Balkaire, he had to freestyle. He was not allowed to read it from a book. He had to make it up as he was going along, and he had to impart the intended meaning. Now, originally, this wasn't considered an important position. We could see from the Mishnah permits even a katan to do the Targum. As long as he understands the text, even a katan could do the Targum. But as the generations moved on, we find a very interesting thing that the position of Miturgaman, the person who is going to translate for the Balkore, became a very prestigious position. And just as an example, there's a famous story, autobiography of Rav Nosson Habavli, an early Rishon who visited, someone who lived in the time of the Gaonim, who visited the Gaonic yeshivas during the installation of a new Reish Galusa, of a new president. And the ceremony that they had included that the Reish Galusa was Ola to the Torah. He would read his portion, and then the Meturgaman would be the Gaon of Bavel. He would get up and do the Targum for the Reish Galusa. So we could see at that point it became a very important minhag, and this is already in the year 800 or 900. They were still doing the Targum in the yeshivos in Bavel. Now, obviously, they were doing the Targum in Aramaic. I should just mention from the Mishnah above that when it came to Kriyas HaTorah, they would do pasuk by pasuk, and when it came to Haftarah, they would do 3 psukim at a time Targum, 3 psukim at a time Targum. So now, Aramaic, we just should take a brief tangent, because most people here are familiar with Targum and Aramaic, but Aramaic is an ancient language which is as ancient and more ancient than Judaism itself. We all know the pasuk in Bereishis, V'yikalo Lavan Yegar Sahaduta V'Yakov Karalo Galed, right? It's beferish a pasuk in the Torah that Lavan spoke Aramaic and Yaakov spoke Hebrew, because Lavan called it the mound Yegar Sahaduta, and Yaakov would call it the mound of Edut. And this language, Aramaic, which still survives today, is really ancient and obviously has hundreds of different dialects. It has dozens of centuries of development, and therefore in every century and in every region, you have many different dialects. So Aramaic is a very complicated language to study and a very complicated language to understand, since it's gone through so much change. This is something that linguists who are exceptionally bright and exceptionally nerdy love to grapple with and love to take apart. Aramaic is one of those great, really complicated, very old languages. So in the first few centuries of the first millennium, many important translations of Tanakh were written, and they were written in various languages and also in various dialects of Aramaic. You had Syriac, you had Latin, you had Greek, you had, of course, Aramaic, and there were so many languages in which in the first few centuries the Torah was translated into. Now, famously, Unclis, which is written in what's called Middle Aramaic, was written on the Torah and became the official standard Targum for Torah. And Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel wrote a Targum in what's called JPA, or Jewish Palestinian Aramaic, and that became the official Targum for Nach. By the Gaonic era, the yeshivos in Bavel, when they did Targum, they would always be Metargum in Unclis. That was the official text. And strangely enough, they didn't follow the Mishnah. They didn't follow the Tosefta. They actually didn't freestyle. They would read it from a book, and they were very exact. They would just do Targum Unclis, very almost yeshivish in a way. And even though those dialects of Aramaic had long fallen out of disuse, and in Bavel they were already speaking Arabic. This is hundreds of years after the Sassanid and all the other empires had left the region. Still, they were translating into Unclis. However, in communities that were under the jurisdictions of the Gaonim and Eretz Yisrael, they did something very interesting. They followed the Tosefta, and they would always freelance. They would freelance the Targum of the Kriyas HaTorah, and sometimes they would add midrashim, and they would add into their Targum a medrash to better explain the pasuk. Now, one of the great disasters of history was caused by Targum, and this is not very well known. This is a mosaic of Justinian I, the Byzantine emperor between 527 and 565. The communities in Greece, I believe, got into a fight. The Jewish communities in Greece got into a fight over whether or not they could start saying Beis HaKnesses, whether or not they could start translating into Greek rather than into Aramaic. They had a Meturgamon. He was translating into Aramaic, but by their time in the 500s, Aramaic wasn't really the vernacular of the people around. And so in those times, honestly, if they would have asked a rabbi, they probably would have permitted it. But the fight among the Jewish communities got so nasty about whether or not to translate into Greek into the Beis Hamed in the Beis HaKnesses that they took it to the emperor, and they asked Emperor Justinian to adjudicate this case. And if you Google this, the novella 146 of Justinian's decrees, Justinian goes ahead and paskins for them, and this was a huge disaster. What does Justinian say? He says that, well, if you're going to translate into Greek, you have to use the Septuagint, the Christian equivalent, and b'diavad, you could also use Aquilas if you want. And oh, by the way, if we catch any Jew, let me just admit someone, if we catch any Jew who is preaching an explanation of the Bible in a way which isn't according to the holy tradition, meaning the Christian teaching, he can be exiled. Meaning that technically, if you were teaching Mishnah, which explained the pasuk in a way that wasn't according to Christian tradition, you could get exiled. And if you look here at the Byzantine Empire at its peak, this was a huge problem for Jews because Jews lived in many of these areas. So this was a huge disaster, and for almost 1,000 years, Jews were living with the consequences of this legislation because later kings used this as precedent to what's it called? I wouldn't say basically to legislate against any Jew who would learn Mishnah or who would write books or publish books that were against Christian creeds. So this was a terrible disaster, and it happened because of a dispute about Targum. Now, what happened to this minhag of saying Targum by Kriyas HaTorah? So it seems that the death knell was, first of all, the rigidity, the fact that the Gaonim in Bavel, like Rav Natronai Gaon Paskins, you can't use anything besides Unclus. And second of all was the disuse of Aramaic, because nobody understood it. It just wasn't something that the Kahal wanted to do. So when communities cropped up outside of the spheres of influence of the yeshivos in Bavel, like in the middle of Spain or in Ashkenaz or in northern France, a lot of these communities, first of all, wouldn't have a Meturgamon. They wouldn't have somebody who could do the Targum, and second of all, nobody wanted to do it. So as soon as the yeshivos declined in Bavel and in Eretz Yisrael, the minhag also completely declined. However, people stopped doing it, but people might have stopped doing Targum, but they didn't stop doing it on special occasions. So although this old minhag of Targum, of being Metargum, the Kriyas HaTorah ended, when it came to Shavuos, when it came to Shvi Shel Pesach, or when it came to a Shabbat Chatan, right, when the Chassan gets an Eifroth, the communities in Germany, the communities in Sfarad, would still be metargem the Kriyas HaTorah for those occasions. But because many of those early communities who did this were under the jurisdiction of the Eretz Yisrael Gaonet, their Targum, the way they were metargem it, was with not Targum Unclus, but their own Targum Yerushalmi. And these Targums, let me give you an example here of one of the embellishments of a Targum for Shavuot. So, as I said earlier, the Meturgamanim would sometimes add midrashim liberally, right? So, because on Shavuot it was the special time when the Meturgamanim would still retain the minhag of being metargim Kriyas HaTorah, the Meturgaman would make it a bigger deal. He's being metargim the Kriyas HaTorah for Shavuos, and therefore, if he was going to do it, he was going to do it with extra midrash. So, if you open up a Mikrais Gedels today, you'll see what's called Targum Yonasan ben Uziel sometimes, but that's a mistake. It's Targum Yerushalmi, and it'll say, let's say the first Anochi Hashem Elokecha, right? This is the Aser Sidibros. Umalel Hashem Yat Kol Dibraya Ha'elein Lememar Divira Kadma'a begins first Dibra, right? It's a poetic thing. Katavan Afik Min Pum Kucha Yehe Shmei Rabba Mevrach. If anybody here is good with Aramaic, that when Hashem opened when the mouth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu opened, it was like thunder and lightning and pillars of fire. It's a fascinating midrash, and it also let's just go a little further. So they would extend and make this very interesting for the kahal. If they understood the Aramaic, they would make the Kriyas HaTorah even more interesting. Now, for people who understood it, they tried to make it even more engaging. And what I'm showing here on the screen is a Taylor Schechter from the Geniza. They found in the Geniza the notes of a Meturgaman who was going to be Metargem the Kriyas HaTorah for Shavuos. And what's interesting is that he was kind of cheating a little bit, because you're not supposed to write them down in advance, but apparently by this time, by the 800s or 900s, nobody spoke Aramaic well enough to do it extemporaneously. So here he is planning his Targum for Shavuos. And if you look here on the top, these notations on top of the word Umer Shus means that he was going to sing it. Umer Shus, right? So Hakel, Umer Shus Hakel Umalachav. Obviously, this is the Egyptian shul, the Ben Ezra synagogue, which followed the Minhag Eretz Yisrael and the Gaonim there. Umer Shus Hakel Umalachav, Gavriel Umichal, Daniel Urfal, Atargem, Ana Avda, Yeshua Bar Avram. Yeshua Bar Avram is going to be Metargem for the Kahal. Divrei Kedoshim Umeirim Reishi B'chodesh Hashlishi Rabbi Isai B'chastechem something Chemla Ve'al. I can't read it all, honestly. His handwriting is terrible. V'hametargem L'fnei V'neichem HaMaschil Ve'omer. Then in the next one here, you have B'chodesh Hashlishi, right? He's going to be Metargem the pasuk B'chodesh Hashlishi. Bi'archa Talita Alim Afgahon B'nei Yisrael Perikin Me'aradim Mitzrayim. So these are really the authentic notes of a translator from the Ben Ezra synagogue in Old Cairo, which is called Fayum, where in their ancient community over there in the 900s all the way to like the 1100s, they would actually do the Targum in the Nusach Yerushalmi, and they would add midrashic expansions. Okay, so where do we get from the Targum back to Akdamus and to Piyyut? So already by the beginning of the first millennium, the first few hundred years of the first millennium, they began adding to the Targum of Kriyas HaTorah Piyyutim, meaning poetic adornment besides the midrashic expansion, extra poetic adornment to the Targum. And there's a fascinating story to the discovery of this fact. So this is Moritz Steinsnyder. He was a famous bibliographer who worked in Germany in the 1800s. He had his own interesting opinions about the Wissenschaft, the world of Jewish studies. He believed that, yes, Jewish studies had to be done, but they should be done academically by universities, not by the yeshivas. So despite being an extraordinary Talmud Chacham, he decided to take positions in academic institutions. So he was working in the Royal Library of Berlin in the 1870s as a bibliographer. And what comes across his desk? A package of 12 papyri from Fayum, from Egypt. And the library recognized that they were written in Hebrew or in Judeo-Aramaic, so they sent it to his desk because he was the guy who was in charge of, he was the reader in the Hebrew reader in rabbinics to a certain degree. And he took a look at them. And papyri have this fascinating quality that if kept in dry conditions, they could last a lot longer than paper. And he noticed that these were piyutim, or poems, written for, and if I'm not mistaken, he found in those manuscripts an Aramaic Tefilah for Geshem. Like when did we do that? By Sukkot. It was like a Tikkun HaGeshem. He thought that was very interesting. So he wrote an article about it in the German Egyptology journal. And that was it. Word got out. He published a journal and he went on with his life. You fast forward 100 years, 2 world wars later. In 1978, there is a researcher in Yerushalayim named Yosef Yahalom. And he began a project into researching the earliest Aramaic piyutim, the earliest known liturgical poetry that was written in Aramaic. And so he contacts the library, which today is called the Museum Staatliche de Berlin. It's no longer royal, obviously, because it was 100 years later. And he asks them, any chance you guys still have those 12 papyri still? And so the answer, yeah. And they take some very high definition photos of it, and they send it to him. And what he saw astounded him. And here's an image from his paper, which discusses these manuscripts. The first thing he found was that these manuscripts could be dated to the 4th century, meaning to the 300s. So we used to think that Piyyutim and the era of Piyyut began like formal Piyyut with meter and some rhyme and good structure. We used to think that began in like the 500s, the 600s, but here's something from the 300s during the time of the Amoraim, where he's finding actual Piyyutim. How did he date it to the 300s? It's fascinating. One of the Piyyutim for Purim, which is like a mock parody, it's like a lamentation that Zeresh says for all of her 10 sons, mentions the gladiator battles that occurred in Eretz Yisrael. And the gladiator coliseums were closed in Eretz Yisrael in the 300s when Christianity became the state religion of the Byzantine Empire. So this could not have been written later than the 300s. And here we have Piyyut written in Judeo-Aramaic from the 300s. And most importantly for our discussion, he found a Piyyut, which is known from Ashkenaz, from medieval Germany, that was written for, he found a Piyyut written for the Targum of Shavuos called Ezel Moshe. And anybody who's familiar with some of the more critical editions of the Machzorim, who have a big fat, I'm holding one here, a big fat Goldschmidt Machzor, will know about Ezel Moshe. It's an Aramaic Piyyut for the Targum of Shavuos, and it describes Moshe's Moshe's fight with the Malach, and not with the Malachim. Moshe's going to receive the Torah, I believe. So what's very exciting about this, besides the dating, is really from a linguistic perspective, linguists went nuts, because all of the later copies of Targum Yerushalmi and the much later copies of the Piyyutim completely adulterated and destroyed the linguistic qualities of the Aramaic, because so many later copyists couldn't speak that early dialect of Aramaic, and so they would always corrupt it with like Babylonian Aramaic, which is spoken from the Gemara. So here they had pristine what's called JPA, or Jewish Palestinian Aramaic, from the time of the Amoraim. And this was really exciting to them. So he got together with somebody named Michael Sokoloff, and he published a book called Shiras B'nai Marava. And to anybody who likes this kind of stuff, this is actually an incredible work. Michael Sokoloff, if you don't know, he wrote these 2 fat dictionaries that you could find in some yeshivas. One is called Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, and the other one is called Jewish Palestinian Aramaic. One is the Aramaic from Eretz Yisrael, the other is the Aramaic from Bavel, and they're very useful if you're learning Targum Yerushalmi, if you're learning Talmud Yerushalmi or Talmud Bavli. He's like the lexicographer on Jewish Aramaic. I tried to find a picture of him on social media, but then I realized lexicographers probably aren't very social. So if you could find a lexicographer and become his friend, I'm sure he would appreciate it. So anyway, where are we holding at this point? But just tangentially, because I find this is interesting, what they did is they combed through the Cairo Genizan, they combed through many different early sources to find all the earliest Aramaic Piyyut that they could, and get a critical edition of it. They confirmed their suspicion from a Gemara Ma'ikatan and a few Midrashim that Aramaic poetry was very important to the women of Eretz Yisrael, because they had this minhag that they would pay eulogizers to write eulogies and poetic hespedim they would pay them to do this for their dead. And they confirmed this by finding many hespedim written in Aramaic poetry. And the sources for this are actually in the Gemara and in the Medrash. So it's a fascinating thing to find real hespedim written poetically from this time. Okay, let's move a little further. So I noted that this poetry was only done by the communities that translated the Kriyas HaTorah into Targum Yerushalmi to begin with. The communities that followed the Gaonate of Bavel were very strict. They were very yeshivish. They would only do Targum Unklis. They would never add expansions. They would never freestyle. So they never added midrashim, and they definitely never added poetry to the midrashim of the Targum during Kriyas HaTorah. So you only find in the Kehilot which followed the Gaonim of Eretz Yisrael, such as Italy and Lebanon and Sicily and in Germany, the earliest communities there who came from Italy, you find these minhagim. However, in other places, you do not find these minhagim to say the Targum and expand it, and also to add these piyutim. So when we discuss the piyutim like Akdamus, which were written to embellish the Targum, the reason the Akdamus was written in Aramaic is because it is an Aramaic poem for an Aramaic translation. It's not written for any other reason. It's supposed to be a part of that Targum ritual, and therefore it is written in Aramaic. And anybody who's familiar, Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur actually wrote more than just the Akdamus for the Targumim, but that would take us actually too much time to cover. So let's recap. Let's take by the 10th or the 11th centuries, where are we holding? We have a situation that if you're, let's say, in early Ashkenaz, where all the scholars from early Ashkenaz are Italian, well, not all of them, but most of them. So what are you going to daven? The first thing you're going to daven is the number one, standard Yom Tov Piyutim. You're going to have the Yitzros, you're going to have the Krayvais. Number two, you're going to have in the 9th section of the Krayvais something called Dibrin. This just makes your Chazar Shas so much longer, because they would have a poetic expansion of the Aseret Dibrais inside the Krayvais of Shavuos. Then, number 3, you would have the Targum during Kriyas HaTorah and the expansions. Number 4, you'd have the Piyutim of the Targum. Number 5, you'd have Megillas Rus and the Kabbalah Tzedakah for all the people to collect money for the shul. And if you're laughing and you think that this is already a long davening, this is just Shachris. We've only begun to get started. You wait until Musaf when they start saying the Azharas of Rabbi Eliezer Hazaken. So this was a really long davening. And as you can imagine, depending on the city, people started deleting things. And the way it worked was that the Chazanim would pick and choose what it was they wanted to say for the Kahal. So I wish we could go into a deeper dive as to how these piyutim work. But what they would do is, this is how it would work. Every piyut that exists for the davening, let's say every genre of piyut, let's say it's a kedushta, let's say it's a yaitzer, there's usually 3 or 4 different ones that the chazan could choose from historically. They would have the earlier ones, they'd have the more recent ones. So the chazan would just feel the crowd, and it'd be like, okay, what do the people want to hear? What kind of piyut do I want to say this chag? And therefore he would choose from his machzor the piyutim that he was going to say. But the congregation had to actually sponsor a machzor for the chazan in order so that he should have all of these. And for this reason, what we have today is some incredible machzorim. This on the screen here is the David Bar Pesach machzor. If you go to the New York Public Library today in Manhattan and you walk straight through the front doors, and there's going to be a museum called the Treasures Museum. You walk right through those doors, admission is free. You're going to see this machzor. This machzor was made for German Jews in the 1300s. And it's a machzor sponsored by the community for the chazan. So they would pay a scribe, they would pay a rabbi, and they would pay an artist to put together these beautiful machzorim. So while the communities were suffering from these longer davenings, as time moved on, more and more things got deleted. Now, we know that one of the first things to go was the Targumim. From that very long davening that I mentioned, one of the first things to go was the Targum, was being Matargum Kriyas HaTorah. People had enough, it was a long enough davening as it was, and we don't know exactly when they stopped saying the Targumim, but we know, for example, that in the 12th century, Rabbeinu Tam wrote Yitziv Piskam. So already in the middle of the 1100s, there's still some enthusiasm for adding even more to the Tefilah. But times began to change, and people didn't really want to have such a long davening, and therefore, already by the 14th century, meaning in the 1300s, we see that the Paiskim who mentioned the Minhagim of Shavuos completely omit it like it doesn't exist. They do mention saying Akdamus, but they do not mention saying the Targumim. And if anybody's interested into the exact development of all of that, I'm holding in front of me, this is the Machzor of Yonah Frankel and Daniel Goldschmidt, two bibliographers who worked very hard to put together a critical edition of all of the earlier German and Polish Machzorim, to get, and really the French also, to get a clear picture, a critical edition of all the early piyutim and all the early rituals of the rites of the liturgy of the Kehillas of Ashkenaz. And if you want to see a comparison as to which communities did what, when they stopped saying it, how much they said, please pick yourself up a copy of one of those machzorim. It's indispensable to research. Okay, so let's get back to the Akdamus. In early Ashkenaz in France, besides the early Aramaic piyutim like Azel Moshe and Arakin Hashem Shemaya, we have Atisul Memre also. We had contemporary rabbis who decided to write their own piyutim for the Targum. So take the late 1000s, the early 1100s, they're still doing this enthusiastically. Everybody's going to Shavuos and getting ready for a 5-hour davening. And everyone's so excited that the rabbi composed another 20-minute long piyut. Again, I'm not from that culture. I would actually get very impatient, but this is what entertained people, I guess. And one of these piyutim that was written to embellish the Targumim of Shavuos was Akdamos Millin. So let's discuss Akdamos Millin. Here, if you look at the David Bar Pesach Machzor, this is the page of the Akdamus. And I'll just note one interesting thing here. You'll see that the artist, really the scribe, enunciates only the ta. The reason for this is because it seems that in those days, they didn't actually do it responsibly. Today, everybody has a Machzor. So the Chazan reads one line and everybody reads the next line. But in those days, nobody had a machzor. The only guy who was going to have a machzor was going to be the Shliach Tzibur. Therefore, until what they would do is they would tell everybody, "Can you answer ta?" And everyone would go, "Yeah, ta. That's all we say, ta." Great. So they would invent a tune with Akdamus where everybody the whole kahal will reply ta, and the same is true in Yetziv Pitkam. Everybody replies rin. And it just makes it easier for everybody, especially if they don't have a machzor. So if you look at your machzor today and you're in the middle of davening, and the Akdamus has that big space between the ta and let's say rishu ta, right? So Milin v'shayut shuta has that big space. It's not for some esoteric reason. It's because the early artists did it this way. I saw the article brought some mystical reason because ta is aleph through taf. It represents the whole Torah, but it just comes from a misunderstanding of how the artist structured it, simply because nobody had machzorim and the kahal needed some way to stay involved. All right, so who was Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur, the author of these Akdamot? So Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur lived in the 11th century. Exactly when he was born, we don't know. We know he died at the end of the 11th century, but what we know about him is his name, Rabbi Meir. We know his father's name. It was Rabbi Meir ben Yitzchak, and we know his grandfather's name, Rabbi Meir ben Yitzchak ben Shmuel Shliach Tzibur. So we also happen to know what profession he was. A Shliach Tzibur in those times was a community employee, and a community employee was an indispensable job. You needed a functionary of the synagogue who knew all the tefillos by heart, who could also do the Targum, because not everybody could do the Targum, and was an expert on the halachas of Tefilah. This was the job of the Shliach Tzibur of the community. And he would obviously have a machzor, and it's known that he had his own halachas for him, but they've been lost to time. We know that he wrote some pirushim. We know he wrote halachas. They've only survived secondhand. For example, if you look in Rashi's, Rashi will often bring halachas or agadas from Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur. And what the little we do know about him is that his contemporaries and all the people who came after him revered him. His contemporaries would call him Hapek Kadosh Mivermaiza. They would call him Hachazan HaHagon, a Rabbi Meir Nehorai, like Rabbi Meir the Tana. And Rashi even calls him, and this is Rashi calls him the Tzaddik. So if Rashi's calling somebody a Tzaddik, it definitely means that everybody revered him, and all the later generations revered him as well. He was clearly a very, very special person. Now, this picture is a alleged Sion. I think it's in Gush Chalab in Eretz Yisrael, but that makes no sense. So again, an alleged Sion of Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur. Now, I should point out that we know him as a poet today, but as a poet, he was unique, but he wasn't artistically original or artistically unique. meaning that he was unique in the sense that he loved experimenting. He would try every genre of piyyut that he could, and he was willing to invent new ones. Like he invented the Akeda genre, he invented the B-chord genre of piyyut. So from him, we have about 50 piyyutim that survived, and he was he was also one of the first Ashkenazi Paitanim to try Spanish meter. He just seemed to love experimenting with piyyut, but he might not be super original in his ideas or from an artistic perspective, but he's definitely a very competent, very good paitan. Now, just to give you an example of why not everything of non originality, I should put, a lot of what he's doing is building upon people before him. Here's, for example, everybody knows that if you open the Akdamus, there's a description given here in the Akdamus of let me just say it quickly because we're short on time. Vilasi pak prishuta, Hashem is beyond description. Givil ilu rekie kine kol chushata dio ilu yame v'kol me kinishuta. Hashem is beyond description. We're all the sky's parchment. We're all the forest quills. We're all the sea's ink, and we're all the gathered waters. And all the gathered waters were ink. Meaning, if all of these things were true, you would still not have enough material to praise God. And this comes from a Gemara, Amarav and Yu Kal Yamim Dio, V'Agavim Kumusim V'Shamayim Yiriyos V'Kol Bnei Adam Lavlar and Ein Maspikim Lichtov Chalal Shorishos. Now this alone, this is where he gets this Jewish poetic concept. But the brother of Akdamos Millin is not very well known. The cousin, really, of Akdamus Millin is a French piyyut. This is from Goldschmidt's Machzor called Afilu Kol Nimei. And if you look at it here, if you could see, Afilu Kol Nimei b'pumei mechalfan, givilei dimtichei dio yamei zalfan, givilim hadur agmei lekumus v'inshei galifan. So if you read the translation under it, you'll notice that these two piyutim, these two cousins, are very, very similar. They both use the same motif. Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur himself reuses this motif in his Targum for the Haftarah, which very few people can actually find. If anybody wants it, I could send it to them. But this is metered. This French one here is metered, and I happen to like this one better. I love the meter of this poem, but to each their own. Now, Akdamus actually replaces an earlier piyyut called a Tzisu L'Memre. But if anyone has time to open Goldschmidt's Machzor, you will find the Atzisul Memre, the Arkin Hashem Shemaya, not Atzisul Memre, which preceded Akdamos Millin. So one of the I want to end this discussion of Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur with a bit of a tangent. There's this very interesting note that Rav Avram ben Azriel writes about Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur. Rav Avram ben Azriel was the I believe the Talmud of the Rekeach and the Rebbe of the Arzura. If I don't have that mixed up, he was a Talmud of the Rekeach and then the Rebbe of the Arzura. He wrote a pirush on piyutim, and in it, when he mentions Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur, he says, "V'hu haya me'avei Tzion." He was one of the mourners of Zion, and that's a very interesting description because the Avei Tzion is a very little known about sect. The Avei Tzion were a sect of Karaim who, in the late centuries of the first millennium, in the 700s, 800s, 900s, the Avei Tzion believed that the only way to bring the Geula was to go to Yerushalayim and bang a gong and be mesavel and to mourn Yerushalayim, to not to eat meat, to fast, to do Tikkun Chatzos, and to mourn Yerushalayim. That was the only way to bring the Geula to not the only way, but one of the only ways was that if Jews would go back to Eretz Yisrael, then we'll get the Geula. That was their philosophy. There were also some Rabbanim who joined this movement of Avei Tzion. Now, they didn't really fraternize with the Karaim, but a few Rabbanim joined this movement. We know, for example, that some Rabbanim believed there was a mitzvah to go 3 times in your life. Rabbi Leo Hazakian himself went to Eretz Yisrael 3 times in his life, as incredible as that is, a scholar from northern France. And to say that Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur was from the Avei Tzion, if he means it literally, that he actually was one of those people and not that he had his own pietistic practices, that would mean that a scholar from Worms had traveled as far as Eretz Yisrael in the 1000s, which is mind-boggling. So either he originally came from Italy or he was an extremely interesting and brave person. No matter whatever it is, the fact that there's a Tzion for him in Eretz Yisrael just adds fuel to the fire of speculation that perhaps he actually was buried in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, that's so much for the interesting stuff. Now, Akdamos Millin itself, let's get to the poem itself. We're not going to do any deep dive into the poem. If you'd like to understand the Aramaic and to understand the poem, ArtScroll published a book called Akdamos Millin. A lot of the Aramaic is, of course, butchered because Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur himself did not know the distinction between a Jewish Aramaic, Jewish Palestinian Aramaic, and Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. He recognized there was a distinction, but he wasn't particularly skilled at writing in a pristine Aramaic. So the Aramaic is complicated, as ArtScroll will take apart. They did a good job of taking apart the Aramaic, but we're not going to go into the text itself. It will be, suffice it to say that there's roughly 3 or 4 sections. First of all, there's an introduction in praise of Hashem and asking reshus from the kahal and everybody to begin praising Hashem. Then you have a description of how the angels praise Hashem. Then you have a description of how the Jewish people, in contrast, praise Hashem. Then you have a dialogue between the Jews and the Gentiles and the Gentile nations. You have this dialogue, this dispute about which legacy is more precious to God. And finally, you have this charge at the very end to learn Torah. Okay, the first datable machzor that has this piyut is from 1279. So in order to get an idea of why Akdamus Millin spread and why it's so universal today, you really have to go back to the manuscripts. So it was only found in the Western machzorim. The French had their own. The French had Afilu Kol Nimei. Other communities had Arachin Hashem Shemaya, which is a dispute between Moshe Rabbeinu and the angels. So it's not clear exactly how it spread, but because we find it in so many machzorim, that is very good evidence that many communities began to like starting to say it, because just having something in a machzor is not proof that people say it, especially if it's a chazin's machzor of 4 different piyutim, he would choose one. It's evidence, but it's not proof. When you start seeing it in many machzorim from the West, and many chazanim had it in their machzor, that's evidence that it did receive continuity and that it was said. It's interesting that by the 16th century, even in the Western machzorim, in Worms, they stopped saying it. Nobody knows why. There's a theory that maybe a chazan dropped dead, but this is all speculation. For some reason, in Worms, they stopped the minhag of saying Akdamus Millin. And in the West, it was popular. In the Eastern Ashkenazi communities, it wasn't so popular at first. However, when the Paiskim began mentioning the minhag of saying Akdamus, meaning the only thing, they didn't say the Targum anymore, but they mentioned the minhag of saying Akdamus, then the minhag spread from the koyach of halacha, and then it took a very interesting turn. The Taz in Taf Tzadi Dalid has no idea about this ancient minhag of being metargum the Kriyas HaTorah in Ashkenaz. So he asks incredulously, what is going on with this minhag of saying Akdamus? You start Kriyas HaTorah, you say a pasuk, and then you start a piyut in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah. He says it has nothing to do with Kriyas HaTorah. How could you interrupt Kriyas HaTorah with a piyut that has nothing to do with Kriyas HaTorah? You should say this piyut before Kriyas HaTorah if you're going to still say it. And it's funny that the other Paiskim don't ask this question because a few of them are actually aware of this earlier minhag of saying Targum. So you have the Panim Me'irais and the Shar Ephraim who just flatly disagree with him and they say, no, you should continue the minhag. And the Shvus Yaakov also held this way in Metz. The Shvus Yaakov, this is the shul in Metz. The Shvus Yaakov held that you should continue to say the piyut of Akdamus Millin inside the Kriyas HaTorah. And what's funny is that 100 years later, when the Shagas Aryeh became Rav of this shul in Metz, in northern France, he tried to switch like the Taz, and he almost lost his job. The Kahal was so furious and so touchy about this minhag of saying a piyut in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah, their favorite Akdamus piyut, and we could see how much they loved it, that he almost lost his job by trying to tell them to change and do like the Taz. The irony is that the Taz is right. If you're no longer saying the Targum, and you're not being metargum the Kriyas HaTorah, then the Akdamus don't really have a place in middle of Kriyas HaTorah. So most communities today have switched to saying like the Taz, and they began saying the Akdamus Millin before the Birchas HaTorah, before the Kayin gets up. So that's the minhag of most kilos today. The real Yekas, especially those from Frankfurt, will say it after the first pasuk. Now, of course, anybody here who has a Hasidic background might be jumping in their seats already. What about the story? What about the famous Akdamus story? What does that play into it? So, of course, we began this year with a question, which is how did this minhag become so sticky? How did it stick for 1,000 years? There was this old minhag to say Targum by Kriyas HaTorah, and only on Shavuos and Shvi Shel Pesach, because no one was in the mood of doing it anymore. And they wrote piyutim for it. And of all the piyutim that people wrote in Aramaic, this one sticks. Like this Piyyut, not Arkin Hashem Shemaya, not Afilu Kol Nimei, not Atzisul Meimrei, none of the Dibrin, this one sticks. So this is where this Yiddish folktale comes in, and I'm going to show you this in a second. There was a Yiddish folktale, which the earliest manuscript of it is from 1630. There was a writer who wrote it down into Hebrew, and he said that he doesn't speak Yiddish, but if you look in 1 of 100 Ashkenaz Machzorim, like 1% of Ashkenaz Machzorim have this old Yiddish story. And I don't read Yiddish, but my friend here who's Italian does read Yiddish. And he explained it to me in Italian, and I wrote it down in Hebrew. This is the first time the story shows up in 1630, and it has all the markings of a Yiddish folktale. We're going to say it together. I'm going to read it to you. It's going to take about 5 minutes, but I'll try to go as fast as I can. I'm sorry. And we're going to go through the story, and then we're going to discuss it a little bit. So this is just inspired by George Lucas and Lucasfilms. In the year 1361, at the time of King Martin de Lance, adherents of magic and sorcery increased in the world. Some of these practitioners of the occult passed themselves off as monks with long cassocks. These monk sorcerers built castles and lived in these strongholds. They grew very powerful and were able to bring to themselves the most beautiful women. The leader and teacher of them all was a master of black magic who was a cruel enemy of the Jews. Whenever he came upon a Jew, he would place him under a spell simply by touching him. When the Jew returned to his home, he would fall down and die. This monk murdered over 30,000 Jews through his black magic. The Jews of Worms sent a delegation to the king to request protection. Since the monk and his followers presented a threat to the power of the king himself, the king then summoned the monk. The monk declared that he would desist from attacking the Jews for a year on the condition that at the end of the year, the Jews would present a member of the community for a contest in sorcery. If the Jews won the contest, the monk promised that he would never again bother the Jews. If they failed, he would kill them all. So the Jews had no choice but to agree. They started davening tshuva, tefilah, and tzedakah, and they dispatched letters throughout the gullus to ask for help, but nobody was willing to come forward to challenge the monk. At this time of desperation, as the months of the year rolled by, one of the scholars of Worms fell asleep, and he had a dream, and in it he saw that the rescuer would not come from the Gullus or from Eretz Yisrael, but he would come from beyond the river Sambation, where the 10 lost tribes of Israel dwelled. It was necessary to contact them for help. Everyone agreed to send Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur, who was a great scholar and known for his piety and the leader of all the Jews in Worms. They sent him with a letter explaining the situation, signed by the rabbinic leadership of the community, supplies for the journey, and 3 accompanying rabbis. After many difficulties and much time, the party arrived at the banks of the river Sambation on a Tuesday, exactly 8 days before the year's time would run out. Now, the Sambation River is impossible to traverse during the 6 days of the week, for it is too turbulent for any boat, and the waters constantly fling dangerous rocks into the air. Only on the Sabbath do the waters calm enough for a boat to sail across, but of course, embarking on a boat journey on the Sabbath is forbidden. Nevertheless, the group knew that the river would have to be crossed on the Sabbath for the sake of saving lives. When the Shabbos arrived, Rabbi Meir instructed the accompanying rabbis to remain, and only he would take upon himself the burden of violating the Shabbos, crossing the river by boat. As soon as Rabbi Meir arrived on the other side of the river, he was placed in prison and told that he would be stoned to death for violating the Shabbos. However, once the Jews of the 10 lost tribes read the community's letter explaining the dire circumstances, Rabbi Meir was released from prison. On that same Shabbos, the Jews of the 10 lost tribes cast lots to see who would face the monk in order to save Rabbi Meir's imperiled community. The lot fell upon a short, lame elder named Dan, who was pious, upright, and God-fearing. Rabbi Meir was told to stay on the side of the river, for he had accomplished his mission, and he could not justify violating the Shabbos a second time by crossing back over the Sambation. Rather, Dan sailed back alone. When Rabbi Meir's escorts encountered Dan on the far side of the river, they lost heart, for how could the rescuer be such a little old man who walked with a limp? Nevertheless, they set out to return. Dan had the secret mystical knowledge of how to use the recital of God's names to effect miracles. Using such knowledge, the group of 4 traveled to Worms through a kfitzas haderech in just 2 days, and they arrived in just 2 days, arrived on the last day of the year-long reprieve that the monk had granted. It also happened to be 2 days before the holiday of Shavuos. When the Jewish community in Worms beheld the little old man walking with a limp, would be the Redeemer, they were struck with terror, for how could he stand up to the fearsome monk who was a master of black magic? In the presence of the king and the great crowds of the Jews and Gentiles in the town square, the contest took place. The monk used incantations to harm Dan, and Dan used recitations of mystical names of God to counteract the monk's magic and to fight back. The monk recited some magic words and created 2 large millstones which hovered in the air. Then the monk was able to draw them down into his hands and grind them up as if they were merely made of sand. Don then took the remains of those millstones and made a huge mountain of them. Then he kneaded the earth of the mountain like a woman kneads dough, and made from it 2 millstones larger than the original ones, caused them to hover in the air, and challenged the monk to bring them down, but the monk could not. After a number of other stages of the fight, with the monk losing each round, Don finally attached the monk to the top of an aged, towering tree, brought the gigantic millstones down, and made them grind the monk into powder. Dan then told the Jews that on the previous Sabbath, when Rabbi Meir accompanied him to the boat, Rabbi Meir had composed and recited to Dan the poem Akdamos Millin. Rabbi Meir requested through Dan that the community recite the poem each Shavuot during their worship services for the sake of his name, for his name is signed in the acrostic. So, a couple of things about this wonderful folktale, and that is, we're not going to really argue that it's not a fiction, because all of the hallmarks of it are that of a Yiddish folktale. First of all, I mean, obviously, it takes place in the year 1361, and Rav Meir died 300 years before that. There was never a king in the history of ever named Martin de Lance. And finally, and controversially, wizards aren't real. So this story probably does not have much bearing on reality. But as historians like to say, folktales don't tell you much about the protagonists of the story. They don't often tell you much about the heroes of the story, but they do tell you everything about the people telling the story. The people telling the story, it tells you what their beliefs were, what their value systems were, what their associations were. And this story tells us many things. It tells us that the Jewish community associated Akdamos Millin with Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur, that they revered Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur as a man of mysticism, that he was a man who died not in Worms, but in some faraway land. And we learn that they associated Akdamos Millin and Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur and this Piyyut with the holiday of Shavuos. So one going theory online, especially from Jeffrey Hoffman, is that this is the secret to the survivability of the Akdamus. At first, the Jewish communities tied Akdamus Millin to Shavuos because, it was a Shavuos Piyyut. But eventually, as this story spread, this clung the Akdamus, this folktale clung the Akdamus to the consciousness of the Jewish people during Shavuos, this heroic tale of salvation, and this really brought the Akdamus into people's consciousness for Shavuos. Another theory is that the Crusades had a major effect on this, because, as we know, the Crusades happened in 1096. Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur died right before, and in the Akdamus is a prophetic disagreement between the Jews and the Christians as to which religion is superior. So people must have felt like this Piyyut was prophetic in the dispute between the Jews and the Christians, and therefore, after the first Crusades and the horrors and the massacres in Worms, people thought this Akdamus Millin, which was written so recently, must be a piece of prophecy of the dispute between Jews and Christians, and therefore it became a major part of Jewish consciousness for Shavuos. Now, there's two problems with these theories. Number one, to say that it's tied with the Crusades is very problematic, because for all we know, Rabbi Meir Shliach Tzibur wrote this in the 1050s, much more earlier than the Crusades, and people would have never had any idea or never would have thought to associate it with the Crusades. There are piyutim written for Shavuos about the Crusades. Yes, the Crusades happened during Shavuos time, and yes, there are piyutim which are more lamentation-like, which are written about the Crusades. And they said them in some places, but Shavuos is a happy time, and people typically would not do Haskaras Neshamas on Shavuos until, well, much after the Crusades. So it's unlikely to say that it was tied in their consciousness to the Crusade. Furthermore, if this story was circulating in 1630, then at best we could say that the story was invented in the 1500s, and you still have to account for a 500-year gap for when this story wasn't around or wasn't circulating widely, for how people and why people clung to the Akdamus. We have at least 300 years to account for why people clung onto the Akdamus more than any other Piyyut. So my theory is this is a special type of luck, because if anybody here has witnessed this in their own lifetime, like I have, when you have a kahal which is trying to abridge a davening which is really long, very often, especially if it's poetic, like the slichot, what they'll do is they'll say the first one, they'll say the popular one, and they'll say the last one. That's typically how people abridge it. So in my opinion, what they were doing was, in many of the kilot, was that because they were abridging the Targumim, they were abridging the davening by deleting Targum, they just simply chose, okay, but what's the first one? What's the one that we all know? What's the one with the nicest tune? The first one, or the most popular one, became the one that they kept, and perhaps one or two more, and that was it. That was it for the ritual, for the rite. So that's my theory. My theory is that it has a special type of luck. You have you mix it with a beautiful tune, and the first piyut becomes the most important one. But I didn't feel like that was enough, and I was searching for another idea. And Professor Dahlia Marks had an interesting idea. I didn't agree with every one of her points, most of her points, but one comparison she makes, which I found very interesting, was that she compares it to Kol Nidre. And this is a bad example, but a good example, because they're both Aramaic. They're both not exceedingly special. Kol Nidre is not about tshuva. It's not about, in particular, not about Yom Kippur. And Akdamus Millin doesn't inherently or internally speak about Shavuos. But even though they're Aramaic, even though nobody understands them, even though the rabbis were kind of against saying it, just like the Taz, still they stuck. And still, for 1,000 years, Kol Nidre, despite all the refutation of the rabbis, and despite it being boring, and despite nobody understanding what it says, for some reason, Kol Nidre and Akdamus lasted 1,000 years. So what is it about that makes Kol Nidre and Akdamus last so long? And so the answer that she gives is that this is a type of symbolism, and this is borrowed from anthropology. But the idea is that there are certain what anthropologists call texts, which are very important from a symbolic perspective. This is called the type of rite she's talking about is called a transitional separation rite, which means that, let's say, take for example Kol Nidre. By Kol Nidre, you're going from Chol, you're going from weekday to Yom Kippur, right? You're transitioning. You're going from the weekday into a much holier time. So when we do a transition, people definitely usually like to invent rituals during those transitions, because it's a time of, so to speak, of danger. People don't like transitional periods. And therefore, during this period, you take symbolic things and you take a ritual and you attach symbolism to it. Therefore, Kol Nidre became the symbolism of, the text doesn't matter. The symbolism of Kol Nidre is, we are entering a holy day. You're entering a court of law. You are entering a very holy day. And the symbolism, not the text, is what became the core of Kol Nidre's stickiness. The same, I would argue, is true for Akdamus Millin. I would say that the Akdamus, I would say that the Akdamus, for the most part, its stickiness is related to the fact that it's when you're opening the Sefer Torah on the Yom Matan Torah. The day that you're giving the Torah is the day on the day that you're opening, that we know is Matan Torah Seinu, we are opening the Sefer Torah to read the Aseret Dibros from it. So that's a very momentous occasion. And so therefore, a tune to introduce this momentous occasion is really symbolic. It makes people feel excited. Let's take an exciting or anthemic kind of tune where we're going to introduce with excitement the reading of Kriyas HaTorah on Shavuos. That's my theory. Take it for what you will. So now, just to end off with how powerful this, let me just admit somebody, just to end off with how powerful this minig was, a person named, I think, Yeshua Danziger wrote an autobiography. He was a Holocaust survivor, and he published this. It was called Echad Me'ir. He published this in the 90s. And he says an interesting story in his autobiography about his train ride to Auschwitz. On his train ride to Auschwitz, which took place Erev Shavuos, he was crammed in there with, dozens, probably hundreds of other people in a single cattle car in awful conditions for 2 days straight. And some people who would know a little bit about Holocaust history would know that if you were running from the ghetto, typically you had a knapsack or a roof sack where you could only carry like one or two things with you onto the cattle car. And the chazan of the community, whose name was Avraham Brun, what did he bring in his roof sack? Of all the things, not bread, not food, not water? He brought his machzor. And he gets up, he tells everybody, Boisai, it's Shkia, and everyone should know that it's Shavuos time, and everyone has to have in mind to be makabel the Yom Tov. And then I believe it was the next morning, they were still rolling on the train, and he gets up and everyone's like miserable, lying on the floor trying to get room, and he belts out Akdamos Millin, he begins singing the entire Akdamus Millin, and this was burned into the memory of Yeshua Danziger. He was one of the last survivors of his city, so it was burned into his memory that there was a Jew who was singing the Akdamus on Shavuos because nothing's going to stop a Jew from feeling like it's Shavuos on Shavuos, no matter if he's in a cattle car on the way to Auschwitz. But what is it for a Jew to feel that it's Shavuos? For an Ashkenaz Jew to feel like it's Shavuos, he has to sing the Akdamus, which is just such a beautiful thing to demonstrate the intense, I'm calling it stickiness, but attachment the Ashkenaz Jewry had to the Akdamus. And I don't know which Rav Avram Brun he's talking about. This was the Chazan of Rav Avram Brun, who's the Chazan of he survived the war. He was an activist in Lodz ghetto, and he was very instrumental in also in Auschwitz. But he survived Auschwitz. He was the Chazan of Temple Beit El in Long Beach, New York, and he passed away in 1998. So it might be the same person, it might not. But this was our exploration into the history of the Akdamus. I hope everybody found that interesting. And if anybody has any questions, we can finally pause for questions. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Shirley, for coming in. Thanks, Mendy. And if you want me to send you my notes, I shall. Okay, let me just see there. Something in the chat. Got it. Okay. All right. I think I could hear people. Mendy, if you're talking to me, you're muted. Hello?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, it occurred to me this Pesach, is Halach Ma'anya maybe also a very old Aramaic relic that really survived our liturgy?
Yes and no. Yes, the Halach Ma'anya is an introduction to the Magid, which is very old, and it is written in Aramaic. Yes. Its history is a little complicated because the positioning of Magid is not where you would expect. The positioning of Magid in ancient times was actually not the way we would expect it. But there's, I think, 3 theories as to exactly when Halach Ma'anya became fixed to where it is now. But Halach Ma'anya, right? All those 3 or 4 psukim there, and Bibhilu Yatzanu Mitzrayim, those are 3 or 4 different introductions to the Magid. Some communities had some communities had the other, and eventually they all got mushed together, and they all got put into the same place. But they were like 3 different introductions that some communities had for Magid, some communities didn't, and then eventually the Minhag Bavel just contained those first 3, and some of the older communities, like the Moroccan communities, for example, retained Bibhilu Yatzanumi Mitzrayim. If you look in Seder of Saidia, we hold the Kara and we sing Bibilu Ya Bibilu Bibilu, and we say that in Aramaic. Also, Halach Ma'anya doesn't say the whole thing in Aramaic, right? Halach Ma'anya De'achlu Avatana Be'ad Adam Esayim Kol Dichfini Tevach Kol Hashata Hacha Lishana Haba Be'arad Yisrael, right? So you have Lishana instead of Lishata.
It's much more rabbinic. It's this rabbinic mix, like the Gemara.
It's yes, but also because it got corrupted, because it originally wasn't pure Aramaic, but later, like, we want the women to understand. It was written in Aramaic in a generation when you wanted everybody around the table to understand. Everyone was going to take a different, portion of the Haggadah to read. So even though originally there was a single reader, but very quickly everyone began starting to contribute to Magid. So they wanted the women to be involved, and so therefore they have stuff in Aramaic. Okay. What else? I'm trying to think if there's other. Kaddish is an amazing tangent, honestly, as far as Aramaic prayers go. But Shiras B'nai Marava is really fun. Let me escape this. Shiras B'nai Marava, if you could find the book, they still sell it online, of the early Byzantine poetry. That's some really fun stuff. Okay, I am going to, if anybody else has any questions, unmute yourself and we'll hear, but otherwise, Laila Tov L'Chulam. Thank you guys for coming. I appreciate the attendance. And good night.
Good night. Thank you.